Hi guys, this video is to cover version 2 of the DYNAVISION mod for Skyrim. Those of you who don't know what DYNAVISION is, it is a mod that primarily gives dynamic depth of field to the game. It actually can also give you static depth of field as well, and I will cover all of those details, but primarily it was focused on dynamic depth of field. And if you don't know what that is, if you look at this scene now, you'll notice Riverwood is in sharp focus, yet the wall and the sign right in front of me are slightly out of focus, as if looking through a camera focusing on Riverwood. And when I look at the sign, you will notice the sign is now in focus, but Riverwood in the background is out of focus. This gives the feeling of looking through a camera in a movie. It's a cinematic effect to focus attention on the subject. And, you know, it's very much an individual taste as to whether you like it or not, but a lot of people do, and it does make very good screenshots and so on. And again, once I look away back to Riverwood, Riverwood comes into focus, the sign goes out of focus. And this mod allows you to change just about everything from how fast it focuses, the strength of the focus, etc. Probably all of you have at least seen some ENB mods, and most of the ENB mods come with a depth of field, and it's similar to that, or at least the concept is the same. If you're wondering what the difference is between them, there are some massive differences, and there are pros and cons with both. The ENB mod depth of field is very good indeed, but it is very demanding on your system. It will generally slow down the game noticeably, whereas with DYNAVISION it really won't slow your system down very much at all. I don't I don't even get 1% slowdown. Some people say they get one frame slowdown, something like that, so maybe a few percent. But generally speaking, it's very, very low impact. So that's one of the pros of DYNAVISION. One of the other pros of DYNAVISION is it's completely customizable in-game. You can actually set the strength in-game, and you can have the strength change depending on the situation, which can be useful. And again, I will show you that. The cons for DYNAVISION versus something like ENB are that the smoothness, the performance of when you focus to when you focus away, how that functions is very much up to the game itself. And it unfortunately is completely dependent on your Skyrim system as to whether it lets the mod have control very often. And the only way to know if your system will run it is to try it. Now, before I show you how the mod works, be warned, when recording these type of videos, it hits my performance massively. So I do actually notice when I'm recording a 1/10 of a second extra delay on this focus process. So when you watch this video, just understand if I'm not recording, the mod actually behaves slightly sharper, slightly faster. That is just an inevitable side effect of the software I'm using to record, because I record in very high quality and it does demand a lot from my system. So just keep that in mind as well. What I see on my screen is usually far sharper and far faster a reaction than you will see in the videos I make, purely because of that. So anyway, when you first load the mod, you will actually find it does not have dynamic depth of field enabled. I've now defaulted it to have static depth of field. If you look at the trees in the distance, and even the mountain, you'll notice a slight blur, very slight depth of focus. As you can see, say, if you look at the barrows, slightly blurred. It gives it a very atmospheric feeling. This is static depth of field, and I've got it doing this as default so that if you start a new game, it starts with this. Because when you start a new game, you're tied up and in a cart, the machine basically doesn't know where you're looking. It's one of the small complications with that part of the game. So I've just defaulted it so that until you choose otherwise, it's static depth of field. So as you can see, both directions. Now, one advantage to the static depth of field is it makes the horizon a little more blurred, which is very good for hiding low detail horizons. So if you're using settings where your horizon is a little less detailed, you can actually use this to hide that and make it somehow look a lot nicer. And it has 0 performance difference, because it never changes. I mean, it's just a filter, there it is. Now, if I press escape and go to the menu, version 2 has an MCM menu. This is how you control it now. There is no DYNAVISION helper, which was a great idea and really sort of worked well until they patched. And suddenly things stopped working. There were some reported problems with DYNAVISION helper, with the scripting maybe causing save game bloat. So I've just completely removed the DYNAVISION helper, and I'm hoping that fixes some of the problems that people were having with their save games. Although again, with Skyrim, it's always difficult to tell. But obviously, you know, without the DYNAVISION helper, you need some way of changing it. So you're going to need the MCM menu, which comes with the alpha version of SkyUI version 3. If you don't have the MCM menu, the only way to change well, basically you're stuck with the default settings. I'm afraid I'm not going to be making any non-MCM menus for this. So if you are dead set against using SkyUI, I'm afraid this mod's not going to be for you. It's just, this is too convenient. So if you look at the depth of field strength, I can actually increase this. I'm going to increase this to 1.3. Go out. And you'll notice now that the trees in the distance and even half of Riverwood is now massively blurred. Now, I would never play like this. But if you like that, if you want the distant world to be almost impossible to see, you can do that. And of course, you can do the opposite and reduce it quite noticeably, 0.5. You will almost not notice this. It's a very slight softening of distant textures, which makes them, you can still see them, but it actually makes them feel slightly further away. So that's it's a nice effect. Again, no performance drop. Completely up to you. Now, of course, the mod... Oh, and you can also turn it off. If you only want it on for certain periods, you can actually just turn it off. I would actually recommend, if uninstalling the mod, if you're uninstalling the mod, it's probably a good idea to switch it off. Wait about a second. It'll say DYNAVISION is now off. Save your game. And then uninstall the mod. And the only reason that's a good idea is when you turn it off, it simply terminates all scripts that are running, which means they're absolutely gone. It's one of those things that's probably a good idea. But obviously dynamic is what this mod is really about. And I will put the strength on. I'm going to put it on high strength so you really do see the effect. And as you saw there, it briefly blurred whilst it was trying to focus. If I look at this rock, you'll notice everything in the background has blurred. I look away, comes back into focus. Now, of course, the amount of blur that you want is completely up to you. Oh, one thing, if you have too much blur, I've now got 1.3. If you look at the trees behind me, you may notice some slight graphical effects, almost like it's getting slightly cartoonified. That is the problem when you get the strength of the in-game depth of field. Oh, that is one thing I forgot to mention. The ENB depth of field has one of the options for the depth of field is something called Bokeh depth of field, which is a very nice looking depth of field. It is actually, it's really, really impressive to look at. DYNAVISION uses the game's own depth of field. I cannot change that. I can only use the game's depth of field. So there's no way to make the Bokeh depth of field effect, which would be nice, but it's just, I'm afraid it's not going to happen. It's one of the cons, I guess I should have mentioned. Now, as I said, I would generally recommend against going above 1.2 on the strength, purely because anything over 1.2, see 1.2, everything's okay now. Those artifacts disappeared, and everything is pretty blurred. Anything beyond that has a little bit of a strange effect. And you should remember that although I've now got this set to 1.2, you could use other settings to bump that over, which I also don't recommend, but there you go. Now 1 is the original default. So as you can see, it's blurred, but it's not too blurred. I've actually changed the default now to be 0.8. I actually find 0.8 to be a little easier to play. As you can see, focused now on the character, the background is slightly blurred, so it's got a nice effect of focusing on him, but it's not too intense. And of course, if you really want something a lot more subtle, a lot, you know, just a slight effect just to make the screenshots look a little softer in the background, there you go, 0.6. And 0.5 is even, obviously, even weaker. Now I've put the strength back up so that I can show you the focusing speed options. But before we do that, I want to tell you a little bit about how this mod works. And again, one of the potential downfalls of using an in-game depth of field. The mod detects how far away the object you're looking at is and then adjusts the focus of your eye. Now, I can make the focus instantaneous. I can actually make it instantly focus once it's detected the distance. However, it takes some time to detect the distance. That's what takes the time in this mod. So, if the mod takes 1/10 of a second to detect the distance, the instantaneous transition would actually take 0.1 seconds. It's not that the focus takes that length of time, it's that there is a 0.1 second lag between the detection of the distance and when you look at it. If your system actually takes 1 second to detect the distance, there will be a 1 second lag. Now for me, I get pretty fast detection. So as you can see, I look off in the distance and my character is now blurred and the distance is clear. When I look back, you'll see my character came into focus almost immediately. I get very little delay indeed. But obviously, that is going to depend upon your system. The other thing is I have prioritized focusing rather than defocusing. So when you look off at something, I bring it into focus before I defocus everything else. You may have noticed that. When I look now at my character, he comes into focus, then the background fades. I've done that specifically to make sure wherever you look, you focus at. It makes it a lot easier to play that way. If you look at something and it takes half a second to focus on that thing, that makes it very hard to play. So with this, it will always focus where you're looking and then defocus where you're not looking. As you see, it's still defocusing. I've got it softly defocusing, but sharply focusing in this case. That was a deliberate decision to make playing with this mod a lot easier. So let's have a look at the settings anyway. If I go along to mod config and look at the focus method, the focus method at the moment is set to soft variable and speed 1.5. So if I change this down to 0.5, this is the slowest type of focus. If I now look away, you'll see the character defocuses quite slowly. But again, where I looked, focused instantly. When I turn to look at him again, he will come into focus very quickly, but the background will slowly defocus. So this speed is how fast everything defocuses. The focus will always be sharp. And again, that's because it is... if you get slow focus like this when playing a game, it's going to make it nauseating to play. And you can change the settings, the speed settings, and increase it, say 2.5. That's pretty fast actually. And some of these settings will be so fast they will look bad on your system. They'll be as fast as the sharp or harsh setting. I've given lots of options just in case your system is slower than most. But as you can see, this is still soft, but it's faster than obviously 0.5. Now, if you really like the sharper settings, there is a totally different focus method, which is sharp. And what this does is it does everything in two steps maximum. So when you look at something and the distance is detected, it will skip straight to the defocus at maximum in 2 steps. So the defocus will be pretty sharp. The focus is exactly the same, still fast, but the defocus will be sharper. And then this is one I can't imagine anyone using, but I put in because someone asked, harsh. The instant the mod detects that you have looked at something, it will focus on it. Again, only once it's detected you've looked at it, which is dependent on your system. The instant I look, the instant it's detected, the character is blurred. Same there, the instant. Now, I think that's a little harsh. Generally speaking, I actually play with sharp. Now, for sharp and harsh, the soft focus speed doesn't matter. The soft focus speed only applies to soft. So generally, I use the sharp focus. But I also never use this strength. Now, one of the major weaknesses for me when using depth of field mods, whatever they are, is that I like to look at the edges of my screen a lot, and I don't always look at my crosshair at the center of my screen. So it's one thing to have a nice focus on, the center of your screen for dramatic effect, but when playing, I find it somewhat distracting. I'm constantly having to put the center of my screen where I'm looking. And this is especially true if you're indoors, where there are a lot of walls and items near to you. And so this mod gives you the option to reduce the depth of field whilst running. Now, running is the default movement. As you can see, this is the default movement, as opposed to walking, this. Now, it's only about 20% weaker when running. So if you look at the top of the wall, you'll notice the background mountain is very blurred. If I move while running, did you notice it becomes more into focus very briefly? And then as I stop, it goes out of focus. So that is the effect. Now you can actually change this under the mod config again, running depth of field strength, and change it to say 50%. Which means it would only be 0.6 when running. And that has a far more dramatic effect. You'll notice everything becomes quite clear. And this means as I'm running around, things will be clear. And then if I start to walk now, oh, excuse me, I was not looking far enough away. I'm running, I'm looking quite far away, and I'll switch to walking, and you'll notice my character becomes far more blurred. And this is very useful when running around dungeons because, you can run close to items and the depth of field effect you get is a lot weaker. It's still there, but it is a lot weaker, so you can run around still seeing everything clearly in the corner of your eyes, and then when you stop, the depth of field kicks in and suddenly you have a lot more focus on whatever it is you're looking at. But as soon as you start moving, everything becomes a lot clearer. And of course that is completely up to you how you do that. I like it to be very clear when I'm running, and then when I stop for it to focus in a lot more sharply for dramatic effect. These options also allow you to do the same when in combat. So by default it's set to 60% strength in combat. This will mean if you go into combat, the blur will fade quite dramatically actually. And it stacks. It stacks with the other things. So for example, now if I'm running and I'm in combat, the combat strength will make it 60%, but the running strength will then half that as well. So in total, it would actually only be 30% of the master value, which would be almost impossible to see. And in fact, some people just don't like depth of field on in combat at all, and you can just switch it off. 0%. That way, you only get this effect when you're, wandering around and not fighting and not searching for things. You'll also notice you can change the option interiors. And this is because, of course, when you're outside, the distances are a lot greater and you're a lot less likely to have something right in front of you. Whereas when you're indoors, especially in dungeons, you spend a lot of time with a wall fairly close to your face. You're going around corners all the time, and it can be too much for some people. So it defaults to about 20% weaker when indoors, and you can, of course, change that. I have given the option with all of these for you to actually go about 20% higher than the normal strength. I can't imagine people wanting that, but maybe some people actually want the depth of field to be stronger inside than outside, and so you have that option. If you're curious as to the settings I use, I have interior 80%, I have combat off, I have running set at, I believe, about 70%, and I actually have my strength at only 0.8. I have sharp focus method because I like to be sharp. In fact, actually, I think I actually run this at 0.7. So in actual fact, my depth of field, I would normally play with this. So as you can see, there is a slight depth of field. Look in the background, but it's not very overpowering. And as soon as I start moving, it fades and is pretty clear. So that's what I generally use. I use a lot weaker field for a tiny effect. Little bit of, I don't know, a little bit of a cinematic focus. Anyway, guys, I hope that answered any questions that might crop up about version 2. Feel free to try it out and give me some feedback. As I've said, there are some limitations to a mod that uses the in-game depth of field, in that I can't change the type of blur. It is going to look like this, no Bokeh off, sorry. And the performance is, well, it really will depend on your system. And the only way to know if it'll work is to try it. I have streamlined all the scripts, and hopefully they will perform a little better than version 1. And the MCM menu, I think, is a massive improvement over the old helper. Even though that was a kind of nice idea, I think it was very difficult to maintain, and there were some problems with it. So that has gone, and that is about it. I hope this video helped, and I hope you enjoy the mod if you use it.